The air changed the moment I stepped inside. Not colder, exactly. It was denser, like walking into a room where someone had been frying something sweet and heavy, then immediately opened all the windows, a cloying sweetness fighting with stale air. Outside, it had been November gray, a damp chill clinging to everything. Inside, the light was yellowed, even though the bulbs looked new. It didn't feel like artificial light, though. It felt preserved, like the light itself was an exhibit. The museum was bigger than it looked from the street. All Victorian brick and Gothic arches, it sprawled back further than I'd realized. I'd been to the public exhibits a few times with Sarah and Leo when he was little. But this back-of-house area was different. Long corridors, smelling faintly of dust and something else, formaldehyde maybe, not overpowering, just a ghost of it. I shifted the weight of my bag on my shoulder. $52,000, that's what the medical bills totaled. Last time I checked, 52,000 reasons to be grateful for a steady paycheck, even if it meant spending my nights wandering around stuffed dinosaurs and moth-eaten taxidermy. Old Man Hemlock, the day security guard, barely glanced up from his crossword. "Elian Wright," he mumbled, not making eye contact. "Sign here." He pointed to a logbook with a stubby pencil. Keys to the main doors and the alarm panel. Codes 1923. Don't bother checking the exhibits. They're all alarmed. Just walk the perimeter, make sure nothing's shifted. See ya. And with that, he was back to his puzzle, already muttering about 7-letter words for arid. No explanation of the shift, no rundown of procedures, not even a good luck, just that. The break room was down a narrow hallway, past a storage area crammed with rolled-up carpets and what looked like disassembled display cases. The room itself was depressing, beige walls, a chipped Formica table, a vending machine that smelled vaguely of regret. But it had a whiteboard, and that's where I spotted somewhere to put my bag, and the rules. They were handwritten in neat block letters. Someone had clearly updated them recently. 1. During breaks, use only the designated break area chair assigned to your shift. Do not sit in chairs assigned to other shifts. If your chair is occupied, stand. Okay. That was specific and kind of weird. Like a middle school seating chart, I glanced around. There were 3 chairs, each with a small faded label taped to the back. Hemlock, Bev, and Elian Knight. Mine was thankfully empty. 2. If furniture or equipment has been moved overnight from its established position, log it, but do not move it back. Work around it. What? Who's moving furniture in a museum at night? Vandals, I guess. Though the alarm system was supposed to cover that? It felt like someone had a really particular idea about how things should be arranged and didn't trust anyone to maintain it. 3. If your footsteps echo in an area where they normally don't, stop walking and stand still for 30 seconds before continuing. I almost laughed out loud. Seriously? Echoes? This place was ancient. Of course, there were echoes. Still, I made a mental note to pay attention to the acoustics. Probably just something to do with humidity or the heating system. Old buildings do funny things. 4. Internal observation windows between rooms may not be used after 10 p.m. Cover them from your side before that time. Now, that was strange. Observation windows? I hadn't even noticed any. And why restrict them? It felt controlling. I figured it was probably a privacy thing for the staff who worked late. 5. Secure the loading dock before dark. If you arrive and it is already secured, do not open it to verify the interior. Log that it was pre-secured and move on. The loading dock. I hadn't even seen that yet. The whole thing felt a little overkill, like they were expecting something specific to happen, and they had a very precise set of instructions for dealing with it. I dismissed it as someone being overly cautious, maybe a former employee who'd seen a few too many horror movies. 6. Do not touch the glass of any window, mirror, or reflective surface after 11 p.m. If a surface has a handprint already on it that you didn't make, cover it. Okay, that was genuinely unsettling. I mean, what was with the glass? It sounded like some kind of superstition, or maybe a cleaning protocol. They didn't want fingerprints on the exhibits. A little excessive, but understandable. 7. If the occupancy counter shows more people in the building than are signed in, do not take a head count yourself. Note the discrepancy and contact the supervisor. That was standard security procedure. I suppose, though, the idea of anyone else being here, besides me and maybe a rogue dust bunny, was already creeping me out. 8. Do not stop moving in the center of the Hall of Dinosaurs. Pass through, do not linger. The Hall of Dinosaurs. That was the big room, the one I'd walked through with Leo. It made sense to keep people moving, prevent loitering, though the phrasing, do not linger, felt oddly stern, like it wasn't just about security. 9. When your employment here ends, do not return to the premises for any reason. Do not drive past. Do not contact former coworkers for at least 6 months. I stared at that one for a long time. That wasn't a security rule. That was a threat or a warning. It was so out of place, so completely bizarre, that I almost laughed. Some disgruntled ex-employee clearly left a little parting shot for anyone foolish enough to take this job. I shook my head, grabbed a logbook, and started my rounds. The Hall of Dinosaurs was vast, the skeletons looming in the dim light. A low hum permeated the air, probably from the ventilation system. I walked quickly through it, keeping to the perimeter, avoiding the center. It wasn't a conscious decision, not at first, just a natural inclination. But as I passed the massive femur of a Brachiosaurus, I realized I hadn't taken a single breath since entering the hall. It felt wrong to breathe deeply in here. The air felt thin, stale, like it didn't want to be disturbed. I was checking the humidity levels in the gem exhibit. It was surprisingly absorbing. All those facets, the way the light caught the ruby, the emerald, it was hypnotic. I hadn't really looked at them before. I just registered them as things to protect. But tonight, with everything quiet, it was different. I ran a finger over the display case, checking for condensation. The glass was perfectly clean, though. Old Man Hemlock must have been thorough before he retired. I hadn't even seen him polish this exhibit, but it was done. The whole museum felt still. Not in a peaceful way, not exactly. More like everything was holding its breath. I adjusted the thermostat slightly, nudging the humidity down by 0.1%. It was probably unnecessary. I was just doing something, anything to keep moving. The dinosaur hall still bothered me, even just thinking about it. I kept picturing that massive femur, the way the shadows pooled around it. My break was scheduled for 2:00 a.m. It was 1:47 now. I finished the gem exhibit and started working my way towards the north wing, checking the motion sensors on the smaller displays. Pre-Columbian pottery, mostly, delicate stuff. Each sensor blinked green, confirming they were active. I jotted down the time in my logbook next to each sensor number. Tedious but necessary. Finally, 2:00. I headed for the break room, a tiny, windowless space tucked away behind the gift shop. It was furnished with a chipped Formica table and 2 mismatched chairs. Each chair had a small laminated card taped to the back. Shift A, Elian, and Shift B, Gwen. Gwen worked the day shift. I hadn't met her yet, just exchanged a few emails about the alarm code. I walked in expecting to find the room empty. And it was mostly, except someone was already sitting in my chair. Or, rather, something. It wasn't a person. It was a coat. A heavy tweed coat draped over the back and seat as if someone had just stood up. It was a dark brown, the kind my grandfather used to wear. It smelled faintly of cedar and something else, something metallic, like old tools. I blinked, thinking I was imagining things. Maybe a cleaning crew had left it. But the room was spotless, and I was almost positive I'd been the first one in here since yesterday. I glanced at the other chair, Gwen's chair. It was empty. I hesitated. I was tired, really tired. My back ached. My feet throbbed. I just wanted to sit down. Then I remembered the rule. Something about chairs. Assigned chairs. Not using other people's chairs. It wasn't precise in my memory. Just a vague sense of restriction. Something about residue. A feeling of inheriting something you didn't want. It sounded ridiculous, of course. Superstitious nonsense. Old museum lore to scare the night shift. Probably some story about a disgruntled former employee leaving a bad vibe behind. I could just sit down. It was just a coat. but I didn't. I stood there for a moment, staring at the coat. It didn't move. It didn't do anything. It just sat there. I took a deep breath, then another, and then I sat in Gwen's chair. It was hard plastic and surprisingly uncomfortable. I fished a granola bar out of my bag and tried to eat, but my appetite was gone. I scrolled through the news on my phone, but couldn't concentrate. I needed to call Sarah. She'd been having trouble sleeping, and I promised to read to her tonight. Just a chapter or two of her book. She'd been looking forward to it all day. But the break room didn't have good reception. I tried walking towards the door, angling my phone, searching for a signal. Nothing. Just a flickering no-service message. The signal was always good near the loading dock, a dead spot in the building's architecture. It was only a 5-minute walk. I glanced back at my chair. The coat hadn't changed. I could easily have just stayed put, called Sarah from the break room, and pretended everything was normal. But the silly, ridiculous rule about the chairs, it had taken hold. I couldn't bring myself to violate it, not even for Sarah. I left the break room, phone in hand, and headed towards the loading dock. It was cold out there, even through the thick walls of the museum. When I reached the dock, the signal was still weak, but usable. I dialed Sarah's number. It rang and rang, then went to voicemail. I left a quick message, promising to call again later. As I turned to head back inside, I noticed a delivery truck parked across the street. It hadn't been there before, and the driver wasn't in the cab. He wasn't anywhere. I was checking the emergency exits on the 3rd floor, mostly just making sure the lights above them were working and that nothing was blocking the doors. It was a pointless task, really. The museum hadn't had a fire in, well, ever as far as I knew, and the automatic alarm system was state-of-the-art. But it was in the checklist, and I'd learned early on that Mr. Abernathy, the day guard, took the checklist very seriously. He'd made a point of telling me, on my first day, that a thorough report is a happy report. I still didn't understand what that meant. The 3rd floor housed the paleontology prep lab and storage. Mostly it was just long rows of metal shelves crammed with boxes of fossils, tools, and plaster casts. It smelled like dust and something faintly chemical, like old glue. The air was cooler up there too. The HVAC system didn't seem to reach that level very well. I shivered and pulled my jacket tighter. I'd already checked the first 2 exits, both clear. This one was at the end of a long hallway, past a particularly imposing display of a triceratops skull. I switched on my flashlight even though the overhead lights were on. Just a habit. Made me feel more official, more like I was actually doing something. As I neared the door, I noticed something was off. It wasn't the door itself. It was the heavy industrial shelving unit that stood against the wall just to the left of it. It was one of those things on wheels, meant to be moved easily, but usually it was pushed right up against the wall, flush with the corner. Now it was pulled out about 6 inches and turned slightly inward, angling away from the wall. It wasn't blocking the exit, but it was definitely different. I frowned. That wasn't right. I hadn't seen anyone up here since my last check, and it would take real effort to move that thing. It was loaded down with boxes. It wasn't like it could have just rolled on its own. Probably just Abernathy doing some rearranging. He was always fussing with things. Still, it felt wrong. I started to reach for the shelving unit, intending to push it back into place. It would only take a second. Get it back where it belonged. Then I remembered something. A fragmented image from the rulebook. Something about furniture. Not to what? Not to touch it? Not to move it if it wasn't where it was supposed to be? It was hazy, an impression of disruption. A sense that something had intended for it to be that way. A sudden, high-pitched whine cut through the quiet. It wasn't the alarm system. It was a mechanical sound coming from somewhere within the shelving unit itself, like metal rubbing against metal, strained and thin. It made the back of my neck prickle. I froze, my hand hovering inches from the cold steel frame. I didn't push the shelf. The whine stopped as abruptly as it had started. Silence descended, heavier now, somehow. I stared at the shelf, the angle of it seeming more deliberate now, more pointed. It was facing a blank section of wall, a space between 2 display cases, a space that didn't need anything facing it. I pulled out my radio and reported the anomaly to Abernathy. Mr. Abernathy, this is Elian. I'm on the third floor checking the exits. The shelving unit near exit 3 has been moved. It's not blocking anything, but it's off, and there was a strange noise, like something straining. Abernathy's voice crackled back, sounding annoyed. Moved? What do you mean moved? Did you move it? No, sir. I was just about to. But then I remembered something about the rules. I didn't touch it. Rules? What rules? Just put it back where it belongs, Elian. We don't need any hazards. I can't, sir. Not yet. I'll log it in the report. He sighed, a long, drawn-out sound. Fine, log it. Just make sure everything's secure, and try to be a little more proactive, Elian. A thorough report isn't worth much if the museum's a mess. I ended the transmission and made a note in my logbook. Shelving unit near exit 3 displaced approximately 6 inches from wall, facing inward. Possible mechanical noise observed. Do not reposition. It felt ridiculous, like I was documenting a phantom disturbance. I finished my exit checks. The rest of the floor feeling colder and emptier than before. I kept glancing back at the shelf. It hadn't moved, it hadn't changed, but I knew now how easily things could be wrong, and how little I understood about what wrong even meant. As I left the third floor, I noticed a faint, lingering scent in the air, something like ozone, but sharper, more metallic than I'd smelled in the break room. It clung to the back of my throat. I made a note to check the air filters on my next round. The fourth floor was always the quietest. Mostly just storage, old exhibits waiting for renovation, that sort of thing. I was checking the fire suppression system today, specifically the sprinkler heads. It was a tedious job making sure each one wasn't obstructed, wasn't damaged, mostly dust, honestly. The museum was good about routine maintenance, but dust still found a way. The floors up here were polished concrete, cold under my work boots. I could smell the faint, clean scent of the cleaning solution they used, mixed with something older, like dried paper and forgotten things. I had the checklist clipped to my tablet, marking each sprinkler head as I inspected it. Section 4B, then 4C. It was methodical, almost meditative. The kind of work that let your mind wander without getting you into trouble. I was thinking about Nessa, my daughter. She'd texted me a picture of her science project, a papier-mâché volcano, and I'd promised to help her with the paint job tomorrow, if I could get out of here on time. Abernathy had been on my case about proactive security all week. I was working my way down a long corridor, the storage rooms lining either side. The corridor itself was wide, maybe 20 feet, and stretched for a good 100 feet before it turned. No exhibits here, just gray concrete and metal doors. My footsteps were rhythmic, a steady tap, tap, tap echoing slightly in the vast space. I didn't think much of it, honestly. Concrete floors always amplify sound a little. I'd been walking these halls for weeks. Then it changed. The echo wasn't just amplification, it was repetition. A distinct, delayed version of my footsteps, following right behind me, even though there was no one there. It wasn't a simple bounce off the walls. It was like another set of boots was treading the same path, a fraction of a second later. It was unsettling. Immediately, I stopped walking. And the echoes continued. Tap, 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 tap. My own footsteps had ceased, but the imitation persisted, fading slightly with each repetition but never disappearing. It was like a recording on a loop, perfectly synchronized to where I had been, not where I was. I remembered something, a fragment from the manual, something about echoes, something about stopping. If your footsteps echo in an area where they normally don't, stop walking and stand still for 30 seconds before continuing. 30 seconds. That was all it said. It felt arbitrary, like a child's rhyme, not a serious security protocol. Probably just something to prevent false alarms, or maybe to make sure you weren't walking into something dangerous. A trick of acoustics, I figured. The temperature must have shifted, or maybe the humidity. It was an old building. Things settled. Things changed. I glanced at my watch. It was 2:17 a.m. I stood perfectly still, arms relaxed, trying to ignore the insistent phantom footsteps trailing behind me. The echoes continued, unwavering, mocking my stillness. I focused on my breathing, slow and even, trying to calm the prickle on the back of my neck. 15 seconds, 20. The air felt heavy, stagnant. I strained to hear something else, anything, but there was only the rhythmic, ghostly echo of my own passage. 30 seconds. I took a step. The echoes stopped. But as I moved forward, a shadow flickered at the periphery of my vision, in the corner of my eye. It wasn't a distinct shape, more like a distortion of the light, a momentary blurring of the concrete wall. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing there, just the gray, featureless wall. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. I continued down the corridor, slower now, my senses on high alert. Each step felt deliberate, heavy. I checked the sprinkler heads, forcing myself to concentrate on the task at hand. But the image of that flicker, that distortion, remained burned into my mind. And the concrete floor, under my boots, felt somehow different. Not colder, not rougher, but hollower. Like there was empty space underneath, a void waiting to be filled. I finished Section 4C and made a note in my log. Possible auditory anomaly, unexplained echoes in Corridor C, complied with Protocol R117. Observed momentary visual distortion. Investigate further during next round. I didn't mention how profoundly unsettled I was. Abernathy wouldn't care. He'd just tell me to be more proactive. The important thing was I'd followed the rule. I'd done everything right, and it hadn't made a difference. It hadn't made anything better. As I turned to leave the 4th floor, I noticed a fine layer of dust coating the heels of my boots, a darker shade than the rest of the concrete. It looked almost powdery, and it smelled faintly of cinnamon, a smell that had no business being in a storage room on the 4th floor of a natural history museum. I bent down and carefully brushed some of the dust into a small evidence bag, labeling it with the time and location. It felt important. I was checking the temperature gauges in the herpetology wing. It was tedious, honestly. Every terrarium, every incubator, every climate-controlled display case, record the high, record the low, note any fluctuations. The building's HVAC was ancient, prone to swings, and Abernathy was obsessed with maintaining specific humidity levels for the snakes. It wasn't the snakes I worried about. It was the paperwork if something went wrong. The air in the herpetology wing always smelled faintly of damp earth and something vaguely medicinal, like a reptile disinfectant. It wasn't unpleasant, just clinical. I made a point of humming along to the static of the radio, trying to fill the silence. It was after 3, and the quiet had started to get under my skin, not in a spooky way, just heavy, like the air was thick enough to push against. I'd been on this shift for 8 hours, and the monotony was starting to feel oppressive. I finished the last of the gauges, double-checking the readings against the logbook. Everything was within acceptable parameters. Good. One less thing to explain. I was about to move on to the mammal exhibits, but I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A small display case, tucked away in a dimly lit alcove, containing a collection of preserved amphibians. Behind it, an interior window looked into what used to be a preparation room, now mostly storage. Old crates, dusty equipment, the occasional discarded exhibit piece. I hadn't really paid it much attention before. It was just there. But now I remembered something. A flicker of a note from the museum orientation, something about windows. I couldn't recall the specifics, but it had to do with covering them at a certain time. A safety thing, maybe? Or something to do with light pollution affecting the nocturnal exhibits. It sounded ridiculous, honestly. But Abernathy had a reputation for being meticulous, and the museum was full of odd rules. I dismissed it. Probably just a precaution. The window was small, and the storage room was always dark. What harm could it possibly do to glance through? Just to satisfy my curiosity. It wasn't like anyone was in there. It was 3:30 in the morning. Everyone was home in bed. I took a step closer, my boots scuffing against the polished concrete floor. I paused, feeling a little foolish. It was just a window. But as I reached out to pull the small roller shade down, I hesitated. That orientation note felt more insistent now. A vague unease settled in my stomach. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a prickling awareness, like I was about to do something I shouldn't. I remembered the coat in the break room, the chair assigned, and the shelving unit nudged a few inches out of alignment. All these little things adding up. It wasn't logical, but I couldn't shake the sense that there was a pattern here, a set of unspoken expectations. I didn't look through the window. Instead, with a quick, decisive movement, I gripped the cord and pulled the shade down. It wasn't a smooth motion. The mechanism was old and stiff, and the shade caught halfway, then snapped shut with a small, dry click. The storage room remained hidden, dark. I stood there for a moment, my hand still on the cord, listening to the silence. The static on the radio seemed louder now, almost oppressive. My pulse felt irregular, not racing, but skipping, like a worn cassette tape. I hadn't consciously registered being afraid until that moment. It wasn't a sharp, sudden fear, but a cold, creeping dread that settled deep in my bones. I forced myself to take a deep breath, reminding myself that I was being ridiculous. It was just a window, and I had followed whatever obscure rule was rattling around in the back of my mind. I hadn't looked, hadn't risked, whatever Abernathy's inexplicable precaution was meant to prevent. But even as I turned away, heading towards the mammal exhibits, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something unseen, something that was perhaps watching back. And the darkness behind that window felt intentional. Not just the absence of light, but an active waiting presence. I added a note to my log: roller shade malfunction, herpetology wing, alcove display, repaired. I left out the part about the orientation and the feeling. I left out everything except the mechanical failure. I noticed a small smear of something dark on the wall beside the window too. It hadn't been there before. It wasn't paint. It wasn't dirt. It was slick, like oil. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to know what it was. I just kept walking. And the image of that dark, hidden room stayed with me, a silent, unsettling weight. I finished cataloging the new mineral display in the gem hall. It was tedious work, mostly just cross-referencing accession numbers with the inventory list, but it was quiet, and the lighting in there was good, not that harsh fluorescent glare you get everywhere else. It was pleasant. I even managed to sketch Greta, the volunteer who helped unpack the shipment, during her coffee break. She has incredibly sharp cheekbones and a perpetually amused expression. It's a good face. It was almost 11. I checked my watch, still a good 2 hours before I had to start the final rounds, the ones that really felt pointless. Just walking the same corridors, shining a flashlight into empty exhibit halls. The museum always felt bigger at night, not in a scary way, just emptier, more exposed, like all the stories contained within the walls were stretching out, filling the silence. I decided to do the loading dock check early, get it out of the way. It was on the opposite side of the building from the Gem Hall, which meant walking through the Hall of North American Mammals. I always felt a little silly in there, surrounded by all those stuffed bison and elk, like I was trespassing. I imagined them waking up and being annoyed at me for disturbing their sleep. The corridor leading to the loading dock was the one where I'd noticed the echoes. It hadn't happened the last few rounds, so I'd mostly convinced myself I'd imagined it. Fatigue, I figured. The building settling, old pipes. It was a big old building. Things creaked. I walked slowly, deliberately listening for any repetition. Nothing. Just the hum of the ventilation system and the faint crackle of the radio. I resisted the urge to speed up. The echo, if it was real, wasn't tied to my pace. I'd realized it was just there. The loading dock door was down. That was normal. It was always down when I started my shift. But it was also padlocked. That wasn't normal. Usually, it was just the roll-up door secured with a heavy latch. The padlock was new, shiny, still a little stiff. It felt intentional. I distinctly remembered something about the loading dock from the orientation packet, something about securing it, a rule, buried in all the safety protocols and emergency procedures. I racked my brain trying to recall the exact wording, something about before dark, and not opening it if it was already secured. That was it. Something about not opening it to check, log it, and move on. It was probably just standard procedure. The day crew maybe decided to add an extra layer of security. I'd complained to Mr. Abernathy about a couple of minor incidents, a flickering light in the dinosaur hall, a loose tile in the foyer, and maybe they were just being extra cautious. It felt unnecessary, but I doubted they'd appreciate me questioning their judgment. I pictured Bev, the head of maintenance, giving me that withering look she reserved for anyone who suggested she didn't know what she was doing. I could just unlock it, confirm everything was as it should be, and relock it. But that little voice, the one that had been whispering since the code in the break room, told me not to. I pulled my logbook from my pocket and scribbled down the time. 11:17 p.m. Loading dock pre-secured padlock in place. Did not open to verify. It felt wrong. Insufficient. Like I should be doing something more. But what? I couldn't articulate what felt off. It wasn't a sense of danger. Not exactly. It was a feeling of disruption. Like a carefully constructed order had been subtly altered. I started to walk away, then stopped. I glanced back at the door, the padlock glinting under the dim security light. I told myself I was being silly, paranoid. It was a padlock, a simple precaution, but the image of that dark storage room behind the window kept surfacing in my mind, the oily smear on the wall, the feeling of being watched, the insistence of these little unsettling details. I added a note to the log beneath the first entry. Padlock unusual. Confirm with Mr. Abernathy on morning shift. Then I continued my rounds, heading towards the dinosaur hall. The air felt colder now, not the usual chill of the museum's climate control, but something else. And as I walked, I noticed a faint metallic tang in the air. Not like iron, but something more chemical, a sterile, almost antiseptic smell. I couldn't place it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was behind that padlocked door wasn't meant to be checked. It was meant to stay contained. I was cataloging the mineral collection. It was tedious, meticulously recording each specimen's accession number, dimensions, and origin. Mrs. Abernathy had left a list of discrepancies numbers missing from the database, descriptions that didn't match the physical samples. It was the kind of work a part-time, underqualified security guard was perfectly suited for, apparently. It kept me out of trouble and away from the darker corners of the museum. The mineral hall was relatively small, tucked away on the second floor. It wasn't a popular exhibit, too many gray rocks, I guessed. Most people wanted dinosaurs or glittering gemstones. The lighting was subdued, focused on the individual displays. Each case was glass, of course, and the hall itself had a large window overlooking the employee parking lot. It was a cold night, and the asphalt was slick with a thin glaze of ice. I could see my breath fogging the glass as I worked. I'd gotten through about half the list when I noticed it. A smudge. On the inside of the window, a handprint smeared and indistinct, but undeniably there. It wasn't a clean print, more like someone had pressed their palm against the glass and then dragged it sideways. And it was high up, too high for a child, maybe shoulder height for someone a bit shorter than me. It bothered me. The museum was supposed to be locked up tight. No one should have been near that window. I scanned the parking lot again, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. Nothing. Just the empty cars and the flickering sodium vapor lights. I reminded myself that I was probably just being overly sensitive. The echoes, the padlock, the strange smell. I was letting it all get to me. It was a big old building. Things happened. People made mistakes. Maybe a cleaner had leaned against the glass accidentally during the day. I started to reach for it, intending to wipe it clean with my sleeve. But then that fragment of something I'd read during orientation surfaced. Something about glass, about not touching it after a certain time. It wasn't a clear recollection, more a feeling of prohibition, a prohibition against contact. I remembered something about surfaces, about marks. If you made one, it wasn't just on your side. It felt like a half-remembered warning, buried in the dense legalese of the employee handbook. I paused, my hand hovering inches from the glass. It was ridiculous, wasn't it? A silly rule about fingerprints. But the feeling was insistent, a prickling at the back of my neck, and the more I looked at that print, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't a casual smudge, it was deliberate, almost pressed, like someone was trying to leave a mark. I remembered the wording, or what I thought was the wording, something about not adding to existing marks. If it was already there, you had to cover it, but don't make a new one, don't contribute, don't interact. I glanced at my watch, 11:42. I didn't recall a specific time mentioned in the orientation, but it felt late. Definitely late enough to be cautious. I forced myself to step back from the window. I needed to think. I needed to be rational. It was probably just a smudge, but the unsettling feeling persisted. I walked over to the supply closet and rummaged around until I found a roll of brown craft paper. It was used for protecting exhibits during transport. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. I carefully unrolled a section of the paper and, trying not to touch the glass, I positioned it over the handprint. It wasn't a perfect fit. The paper was too narrow, and I had to overlap two pieces to completely cover the smudge. I taped the paper securely to the window frame, obscuring the handprint from view. It looked clumsy, makeshift, but it was done. As I walked back to my mineral cataloging, I realized I hadn't even bothered to check the parking lot again. I hadn't bothered to look for any sign of who might have made that print. I just covered it up. I told myself it was because of the rule, because I didn't want to risk whatever consequences might come from touching the glass. But a small part of me knew it was more than that. I was afraid of what I might find. The list of discrepancies lay forgotten on the table. I couldn't bring myself to focus on accession numbers and dimensions anymore. My mind kept returning to that handprint hidden behind the brown paper. And as I sat there, I remembered something else. Something I hadn't thought of until that moment. The storage room, the one visible through the window in the loading dock. The window had been spotless, impossibly clean. Now I realized there hadn't been a single fingerprint on any of the windows I'd seen. Not one until tonight. I glanced back at the brown paper, taped to the glass. It felt like a warning, not about the handprint itself, but about the fact that someone had been able to reach it in the first place. Someone had been on that side of the glass looking in. And I hadn't checked the parking lot. I hadn't even bothered to look. I just covered it up and walked away. And now I had a growing suspicion that I'd made a mistake. A significant one. I was cataloging the mineral collection, specifically the amethyst geodes. It was tedious work, measuring, weighing, noting inclusions, but it was quiet. The kind of quiet that settles into your bones after a few hours. The fluorescent lights hummed, a high-pitched whine I'd almost stopped noticing. I'd been at it since just after midnight, trying to get through at least half the new acquisition before my 3 a.m. walkthrough. Gwen, the day shift guard, had mentioned they'd gotten a large donation from a private collector. Mostly quartz variations, she'd said, but a few interesting amethysts. The cases were cold to the touch, the glass slick with a film I wiped down every round. It wasn't dust exactly, more like condensation, even though the humidity was controlled. I was comparing the purple hue of a Brazilian geode to a chart in the catalog when I remembered I hadn't checked the occupancy counter in a while. It was on a small monitor near the front entrance, linked to the security system. A simple digital display. Number of people signed in, number of people currently detected. Part of the initial checklist. I stretched my back popping and walked towards the front of the museum. The polished marble floor felt cool under my worn work boots. I passed the dinosaur exhibit, the skeletal Tyrannosaurus Rex looming in the dim light. It always gave me the creeps, even after weeks of seeing it. Not because it was scary, exactly, just imposing. A reminder of things that existed before and will exist long after I'm gone. I glanced at the break room as I passed, and the coat was still draped over my chair. Irritating, but I'd gotten used to it. Silas, the weekend guard, must have forgotten it again. The occupancy counter blinked at me as I approached. Signed in, 3. Detected, 4. My stomach did a little flip. Just a glitch, probably. The system was old. I'd mentioned it to Mr. Abernathy, the security manager, during training, but he'd just waved it off, saying the system was robust enough. But that was before the loading dock, before the handprint, before all of it. I started to walk towards the sign-in log, intending to double-check the entries. See if someone hadn't signed out properly. Maybe it was just a simple mistake, but something stopped me, a smell. Not unpleasant, but wrong, like ozone. That metallic tang you get right before a thunderstorm, but without the rain. It was faint, but noticeable, and it was strongest near the front doors. I paused, my hand already reaching for the logbook. It was probably just the cleaning crew, I thought. They sometimes used products with a strange odor. I'd asked Gwen about it once, and she'd said it was a disinfectant, something new they were trying. But the cleaning crew didn't come until after I left. And the smell wasn't like any disinfectant I'd ever encountered. It was sharper, more electric. Then, a flicker in my peripheral vision. A movement near the front windows. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the darkened street outside, reflecting in the glass. The windows were all covered with the security film, the kind that prevents shattering. Still, it felt like something had been there, something watching. I remembered a phrase from the handbook, something about discrepancies, about not trying to resolve them yourself, something about contacting Mr. Abernathy. It wasn't a clear memory, more like a feeling of obligation, an instruction to defer. Don't investigate, just report, don't add to the problem. I pulled out my radio and pressed the call button. Abernathy, this is Elian. I'm showing a discrepancy on the occupancy counter. Signed in, 3, detected, 4, and there's a strange odor near the front entrance. Static crackled in my ear for a moment. Then, Abernathy's voice, gravelly and impatient. Odor, Elian? What kind of odor? I can't really describe it. Sort of metallic. Like ozone. Ozone? Probably a faulty electrical fixture. Don't waste my time with smells. Just verify the sign-in log and make sure everything is secure. But sir, the counter? I heard you, Elian. Counter glitches happen. Verify the log. That's all. He clicked off. I stared at the radio, my hand still gripping it. Verify the log. He didn't want to deal with it. He didn't want me to deal with it. He just wanted it to go away. But the counter still read 4, and the smell was still there, a subtle hum in the back of my nostrils. I didn't move towards the logbook. I didn't want to. Instead, I walked back to the mineral collection. The image of the glowing digital 4 burned into my mind. I started recataloguing the amethysts, my hands shaking slightly. It wasn't a tremor from fear, exactly. More like a persistent vibration, a low-frequency hum that resonated through my fingertips. I found myself sketching in my notebook, absent-mindedly. Not a face this time, just a series of lines and angles, attempting to capture the shape of the scent, a jagged, erratic pattern. It didn't look like anything, but it felt accurate. The air in the museum felt colder now, even with the constant hum of the ventilation system. And the quiet wasn't quite the same anymore. It felt expectant. I was doing inventory in the main hall, the dinosaur skeletons looming over me like silent judges. It was the kind of task that felt necessary, but pointless. Mostly just confirming that the T-Rex was still there, hadn't sprouted wings and flown off during the night. The museum director, Abernathy, was big on meticulous records. It ate up time I didn't have. Time I could be spending trying to find a second job, something, anything, to chip away at the debt. I was logging the serial numbers on the display cases surrounding the Triceratops, meticulously noting each one in my little notepad. It was quiet, maybe quieter than usual. The ventilation system seemed to be working overtime, a low, consistent drone that vibrated through the floor. I kept glancing at the occupancy counter as I moved, just a habit now, a nervous tick, still reading 3 signed in, 4 detected. I'd stopped mentioning it to Abernathy. He clearly wasn't interested. The hall itself is huge. The main floor, they call it. It stretches almost the length of the building, with those skeletons dominating the space. The floor is polished granite, cool to the touch even through my work boots. Sunlight, what little we get in this town, filters through the enormous arched windows, casting long, distorted shadows. It's a beautiful space, I guess, impressive, but mostly it just feels empty. I reached the center of the hall, right under the massive Brachiosaurus, and that's when my radio crackled and went silent. No static, no hiss, just nothing. I checked the volume, twisted the dial, flipped the power switch off and on. Dead, which was annoying. I'd been listening to a baseball game, a stupid low-stakes thing that had been keeping the silence at bay. I'd have to find Abernathy in the morning and get a new battery or a new radio. I stood there, fiddling with the radio, trying to coax a signal out of it. It had been working perfectly fine a minute ago. Maybe the interference from the skeletons? It was a ridiculous thought, but I was grasping at something, and then I realized how long I'd been standing still, right in the middle of the hall. That little fragment of something I'd read flashed through my mind. Something about not lingering, not stopping in the big rooms. It wasn't a specific instruction, more of a feeling, a warning. It was buried in that document, the one Abernathy had made me sign on my first day, full of obscure rules and regulations. Something about broadcasting your position, about being visible. It had sounded paranoid then, the kind of thing a security director would fixate on. Now, I told myself it was just coincidence. The radio malfunctioned. I stopped to fix it, and I'm now overthinking a vaguely worded instruction. It's the lack of sleep, I thought. The stress, the bills, it's just my imagination running wild. I needed to get back to work. I started to move, to walk towards the nearest display case. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not like someone was in the hall with me, but like eyes were on me from everywhere at once. I glanced up at the Brachiosaurus, at its empty eye sockets, then at the Triceratops, then towards the arched windows. Nothing, just shadows. But as I took a step, I saw something in the polished granite floor. A distortion, not a reflection exactly, more like a ripple. A heat shimmer, but the floor wasn't hot. It was a circular area, maybe 6 feet across, and within that circle the granite seemed to waver, like looking through imperfect glass. And within that wavering circle I thought I saw something moving. It wasn't a shape, not exactly. It was more of a darkness, a shifting void that seemed to absorb the light. It wasn't under the granite, but in it, like a shadow within the stone itself. It didn't have edges, it didn't have form, it just was. And it was growing, slowly, expanding outwards from a central point. I didn't hesitate. I started walking quickly, but not running. That felt wrong. I walked deliberately, purposefully, moving towards the nearest exhibit, a collection of prehistoric insects encased in amber. I kept my eyes fixed on the amber, refusing to look back at the center of the hall. I kept walking until I was pressed against the glass, my hand resting on the cool, smooth surface of the display case. I risked a glance back. The distortion was still there, but it was smaller now. Receding, the darkness was shrinking, fading back into the granite, and as it disappeared, I noticed something else. The dust motes, usually swirling lazily in the sunlight, were gone. The air was completely still, and the temperature had dropped, significantly. I shivered. Despite myself, my breath puffed out in a small cloud. I checked the thermostat on the wall, still set at 72 degrees. The display case felt colder than it should, and I could almost feel the glass vibrating. I logged the serial number, my hand cramping, and then I moved on. I didn't look back again. I kept walking, meticulously cataloging each display case, each fossil, each tiny, insignificant detail. But the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. It had intensified. And now it felt less like observation and more like anticipation. I finished the inventory, but I couldn't shake the image of that shifting darkness in the granite. It wasn't a visual memory, exactly. It was a feeling, a cold hollow ache in the center of my chest. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see, and I knew with a chilling certainty that whatever it was, it hadn't finished with me yet. I made a note to check the granite floor again on my next round, just to be sure. I was cataloging the mineral collection, specifically the fluorite specimens. It was tedious work, cross-referencing the inventory list with the physical samples, noting any discrepancies in color or clarity. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a low constant drone that usually faded into the background, but tonight it felt insistent, like a pressure in my ears. I'd switched to decaf 1 week ago, trying to cut back on the jitters, and the lack of caffeine wasn't helping my focus. My eyes kept drifting towards the security monitors. Nothing, just empty hallways and shadowed displays. The fluorite was arranged by origin, Kentucky, Illinois, New Mexico. Each piece was labeled with a small handwritten tag. The ink faded with age. I picked up a particularly vibrant purple cube from Cave-in Rock, Illinois. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. I ran my thumb over the smooth crystalline surface. It was calming, almost meditative, to focus on the details, to lose myself in the geometry of the stone. It was a welcome distraction from the mounting bills, from the worry about how much longer I could keep up with everything. I had to call Selma tomorrow. She'd been asking about the results of her latest tests. She hadn't said it outright, but I knew what she wanted to know. I'd promised to be honest, no matter what. But honesty felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. Every good report was a small victory, a reprieve from the inevitable. Every bad report, well, I didn't want to think about the bad reports. I finished the Illinois section and moved on to the New Mexico specimens. Mostly greens and blues, less saturated than the purples. I noticed a small, almost imperceptible wobble in the display case. It wasn't a vibration, not like the building settling. It was more like a tremor. I touched the glass, bracing my hand against it. Solid, stable. I probably just imagined it. This place played tricks on you, I supposed. All those shadows, all that silence. It was easy to start seeing things. Then the phone rang. It was Boyd, the day guard. He sounded flustered. "Elian, you won't believe this. My daughter, Ness, she left her backpack here this afternoon. She was here with a school group. I just realized it when I was locking up. It's got all her school books, her Chromebook, everything. Can you let me back in to get it?" My stomach tightened. The loading dock. The padlock. I remembered the rule, or at least the feeling of it. Don't open it. Log it if it's already secured, but don't open it. It hadn't been a direct instruction, more of a pressure, a sense of wrongness. But it was there, lingering at the edge of my memory. He sounded desperate. "Please, Elian. It's a school project that's due tomorrow. She'll fail if she doesn't get it back. I'm really sorry to ask this." I stalled. "Let me check with dispatch. Boyd, just give me a moment." I didn't call dispatch. I knew what they'd say. Follow protocol. Don't compromise security. But it wasn't about protocol, not really. It was about that feeling, that cold, heavy weight in my chest, that instinctive certainty that opening that door was wrong. It was probably nothing. Boyd was a good guy, a little scatterbrained, but good. His daughter was just a kid, a simple misunderstanding. It's just a backpack. I could just quickly open the door, Boyd could grab it, and everything would be fine. No harm, no foul. I could explain it to dispatch as a minor oversight, a harmless mistake. But the thought of even approaching the loading dock sent a shiver down my spine. I moved. Not towards the phone, not towards dispatch, but towards the main entrance. I grabbed my jacket, the one I always left on the designated chair in the break room, even though it was a little warmer than I needed. Old habits. I started to write a note for the log. Boyd requested access to retrieve daughter's backpack. Denied due to security protocol. But my hand froze. I didn't finish the note. I didn't call dispatch. I walked outside, around the building, and towards my car. I unlocked the doors, got inside, and started the engine. I drove away. I didn't look back. I didn't leave a message for Boyd. I didn't explain. I just drove. I drove until the museum was a distant dark shape against the horizon. I drove until the feeling of being watched started to fade, replaced by a different, colder feeling, a feeling of finality. I knew with a sickening clarity that I hadn't just avoided a security breach, I had avoided something else, something far worse, and I knew just as surely that I would never know what it was. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. But there was nothing there, only the empty road, stretching out into the darkness, and the weight of a rule obeyed, a door left unopened, a question unanswered. I had a sudden unsettling urge to sketch Boyd's face, but I didn't want to remember him. Not now, not ever. The unemployment check lasted barely a month. May at the clinic was sympathetic, extending our payment plan again. But sympathy doesn't cover copays. I started applying for everything: delivery driver, warehouse stocker, overnight gas station attendant. Anything. I even considered going back to school. But the thought of taking on more debt felt absurd. Then I saw the ad again. Museum security. Overnight shift. Same pay, same benefits. I almost didn't apply. The memory of that place felt like a bruise, a dull ache that flared up when I least expected it. But the bills were piling up, and Selena needed her medication. I didn't mention it to her at first. It felt dishonest, like I was trying to erase what had happened. But she noticed my renewed activity, the hours I was spending online. "Another application?" she asked one evening, her voice weak. I nodded. "It's the museum again?" She didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked at me with those tired eyes. "Ilian," she finally said, "you looked different when you came home that last night. Not ill, just smaller, like something had been taken from you." I dismissed it. "Just stressed, honey. It was a weird shift, a lot of little things going wrong, a series of unfortunate events. That's all it was. A broken thermostat, a flickering light bulb, a difficult phone call. I hadn't even told her about Boyd in the backpack. It felt irrelevant now. A minor annoyance in a string of minor annoyances." I got the job back. They didn't ask about why I'd left. Just seemed relieved to have someone reliable. I started the following week. The same routine, the same halls, the same unsettling quiet. The new guy, Zane, gave me a quick rundown. "Everything's pretty much the same as last time, except we got a new dispatch system, and they've decided to rotate the break room chairs every shift. Keeps things fair, apparently." I didn't ask. The first few nights were uneventful, almost disappointingly so. I found myself constantly scanning the rooms, checking for misplaced objects, listening for echoes. I even subconsciously adjusted my route to avoid lingering in the central hall. Old habits, I told myself, just being cautious. I started sketching again, mostly architectural details. The ornate carvings above the entrance, the geometric patterns of the floor tiles. It was a way to occupy my hands, to focus on something concrete. I avoided sketching people too many faces, too much remembering. Last Tuesday, I was making my rounds in the dinosaur exhibit. The T-Rex skeleton loomed over me, a silent prehistoric giant. That's when I noticed it. A small rectangular patch on the floor, right in front of the display. It was a slightly different shade of tile, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I stared at it for a long time, trying to rationalize it. A repair? A replacement tile? But the grout lines didn't quite match. It was too clean, too perfect. My hand went instinctively to my notebook, and I began to sketch the patch, meticulously outlining its shape, noting the subtle color difference. Then I remembered. Not a specific rule, but a feeling. A pressure behind my eyes, a sense of wrongness. Not to touch it, not to draw attention to it, just to acknowledge it and move on. I finished the sketch, tore the page from my notebook, and crumpled it into a ball. I dropped it into my pocket, then continued my patrol. I didn't look back. This morning, I was at the grocery store, standing in the produce aisle choosing apples. Red Delicious, Selena's favorite, and for a split second, the perfectly arranged apples all facing the same direction. The same slight sheen, registered as unsettling. I paused, my hand hovering over a particularly flawless apple. It was just apples, of course, just a display. But the perfectly aligned rows, the identical shapes, triggered something deep inside me, a flicker of that old fear. I quickly grabbed a bag, filled it with apples, and hurried to the checkout. I didn't linger. I didn't make eye contact with the cashier. I just wanted to get out. And as I walked to my car, I felt my hand instinctively reaching for my pocket, as if to check for something I'd lost, as if to make sure everything was still in its place. And I knew with a quiet certainty that it would always be this way now, that the museum, and whatever lived within its walls, had left its mark, a permanent, invisible alteration. Something I would carry with me, always.